So, Will Peck, you're doing a residency here at the Centre for Recent Drawing, and I understand the director, Andrew Hirsch, invited you. Can you talk to us a bit about it, please?
Yeah, Andrew invited me at the beginning of the year to do a residency here with someone else under the new scheme of collaborative residencies going on in space. There was kind of a discussion about who would be interested in coming, and then Gordon was one of the people, and I was interested to work.
Why were you interested in Gordon, particularly in his practice?
From knowing his practice a bit before and seeing some of the work he'd been producing recently, I was interested in using this space as a sort of a kind of discussion that I thought Gordon would be kind of an interesting person to do this with, especially from the kind of work that it's focused on kind of systems and kind of idea of constraint. And I was kind of interested in the residency as a kind of constraint of some sort.
And Gordon, can you tell us a bit about that?
Actually, I think the conversation, because I derived from the fact that I visited your show. Which was a group show, wasn't it? I can't remember what it was called actually. And I think I didn't come to the opening, but I specifically came on the Saturday.
Yeah.
And you were there. We got into conversation and stuff.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. Obviously, always interesting to be invited to do a piece of work. It was somewhat interesting time for me to be asked that, specifically in the context of the Centre for Recent Drawing, is because I had a solo show last year where it was specifically me about me producing what I then saw as the final drawings. So then being asked to do a drawing residency created some interesting possibilities.
And can you talk to us about the thinking and making that you've done during this residency now?
Well, we've been not necessarily making a huge amount of kind of objects or any kind of physical work, but have been spending time in the space and intervals during the residency and having conversations, and in some way kind of documenting these conversations through texts or through kind of marks on the floor.
And has there been a particular focus or subject or?
Yeah, well, we've been kind of talking a lot about kind of preliminary aspects of work, a kind of backstage aspect of process, what that might mean to not necessarily make fixed objects, but to kind of remain in this point before something is made, in a kind of gestation period of purely thinking about something, the possibility of what it could be, and then not necessarily quite reaching that.
Yeah, because we had lots of conversations about what's the form of the residency in a way, and also the form of a space that you might enter into and produce work in. It's a kind of space that, in a way, has the kind of ideology, at least, or the possibility of openness. And a lot of conversations we had, could we produce a piece of work that maintained that kind of sense of openness, but without actually being an object. So we went through various iterations of how we might actually formally make that, and we're still discussing that really.
Were there points of difference that you could identify, Will, in this conversation that you had with Gordon?
Yeah, or maybe in the point now is coming to realise some of those differences, maybe, which would be in some way the kind of contradiction of maybe of rather to make something out of this, not necessarily an object, but if it would be a piece of work, what kind of work would that be? And the kind of discussion of if that needs to be made in any form, or if it can be purely as relevant as making something to not make anything at all and to have purely just engaged in the process.
Will you display, or will you in any way show the notes that you've taken, for instance, about this thinking and making?
Well, I mean, the notes, we've both taken separate notes, which we did experiment afterwards once or twice about how they would be formalised. And we were discussing at one point maybe creating a text which would be like a kind of Socratic dialogue between the various positions. And
What does Socratic dialogue mean?
it would be a kind of essayistic form between different actors who would be having a conversation, as in like a play, where you would be discussing the ideas specifically around the space of possibility, in a way, that in a way the kind of the traditional history of the art space creates. If that makes sense.
It does. Perhaps this is a development. This situation here with you two sitting here is in some way related to that.
Yeah, I guess so in some ways. Yeah.
And where will you go next, you two? Would you? Is your collaboration almost completed, or are you going to do some more work later?
Well, it's not really necessarily that decided yet. We have a little while left of this planned.
Yeah, but we're going to have an open studio day, which is on the, I can't remember what's the date?
The 27th.
Yeah, which will be on the Saturday, and that will be the final work, I guess. Yeah.
Will there be something on the wall or not?
I think it's still too early to say, actually.
If there isn't anything on the wall and it's an open studio, then what do people come to do?
I mean, at the moment we're discussing about maybe having ourselves in the space.
Will you be in conversation with people who visit?
I know we were discussing that actually just now.
Just before. But
Yeah. You felt a little reticent about that.
yeah, I was in some way reluctant to purely have this as the work. That it would just be this kind of conversation with people. So I was kind of nervous that it might become quite an awkward situation, or it might not end up amounting to anything too interesting from those conversations. But I think the ideas of having this kind of day, the opening day, as a kind of event, and that something that happens throughout this day becomes in some way the work that's being kind of seen as it's being made.
If there is a work as such, in a way.
Then, if that is the case, then would it be considered a performance?
I mean, I think to draw back before one categorises it as wall piece or performance, whatever, is that the nature of the conversation is really reflecting on sitting in the space. Yeah. And what is it first to be invited? What's the subtext of being invited? What are the kind of expectations, not in a kind of onerous sense, but what's the tradition of sitting in that kind of space with another artist in the kind of context of residencies, which I guess are relatively recent form. They've probably been around for 50 years, if that, I guess. And reflecting on being in that space and the possibilities that space may or may not give you as an artist. So in a way, a lot of our conversations have had that kind of self-reflexive nature in a way.
And does it make a difference, or is it very particular that this is a Centre for Recent Drawing rather than a white cube gallery?
Well, I mean, this is the question whether the kind of the details of the space, like the kind of idiosyncrasies of an old Victorian building, whether in effect, because you're situated within a kind of an ideological space in a way, of tradition, of certain kind of notions of art practice, whether that's in an immaculate white space or in an old Victorian building that has white walls, because you're in a way you're inhabiting the possibilities of abstraction in a way. So in a sense you're dislocated from the actual space per se, and you're inhabiting an idea.
So that's interesting. Has it in any way impacted in your own individual practice, this collaboration?
In some ways, I mean, I'm very much in a kind of non-artifactual mode at the moment. So I think I guess that's why my interest has been in the conversation.
Can you elaborate briefly on that non-artifactual?
Well, as I say, it's come from, I specifically mainly draw. So because I've stopped drawing now, for various reasons, which we can go into if you want. But yeah, that's why I'm in the kind of a kind of scotoma in a way, in a kind of blank space at the moment.
Okay. And Will, can you talk to us about your individual practice and how this collaboration with Gordon has impacted on your thinking and making?
Yeah, I think in some ways probably the biggest thing has been to really think about the idea of an artefact and what it means to maybe present something as a kind of as a sort of legacy to something that's happened before, rather than to use any kind of an exhibition or the point of showing work as a kind of period of making. And that's something I was kind of interested in before, in how that kind of production could be written into display. And probably from doing this is probably the idea that's come out the most, that is being not necessarily so much things are being made about, but have been thought about a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.